Hello, I'm Brian Fox. Welcome to I Hate Rock Music. Today I'm going to cover a band that actually has a much higher profile than a lot of bands I cover due to the very high profile of guitarist Gary Moore, who is now officially a legend. Done a lot of work over the years, including Coliseum 2, sitting in with Thin Lizzy on their 78 tour. A lot of great solo work. So the boys have been around. But I want to talk about the band Skid Row. And unfortunately, I have to clarify the Irish Skid Row because a U.S. hair band with Sebastian Bach eventually ended up claiming the name Skid Row. And so now we have to clarify it. But for me, there's always only going to be one Skid Row. And I stumbled across them, another one of those finds in the cutout bins. I think it was about 1972. I looked through the bins and here's this green psychedelic cover, and there's three guys, and they got really weird song titles, and I knew I was in for something. And I wasn't disappointed when I got the album 34 Hours home and heard something amazing. But they have an interesting history. They started in 1967, and they had a guy named Ben Cheevers on guitar, and Phil Lynott of Thin Lizzy was on vocals. And when you hear their first two singles, one of them has Phil Lynott singing the vocal, very beautiful vocal, I might add. And the other three songs have Gary Moore singing on them. He had a really distinct voice. His voice got a lot weirder in later Skid Row, but you can hear the germ of it in these early singles. And the other thing that's interesting about those first two singles, released on Song Records in Ireland, is they were mostly acoustic. There's one that has a Gary Moore guitar solo that's pretty stunning for somebody that was probably 14, 15, 16 years old at the time. So very accomplished already. And there's also a weird kind of jazz influence in one of the tunes. And that makes sense when you hear their later material because the rhythm section was very capable of playing jazz. And I think that's why Skid Row's material ended up so bizarre in their arrangements and so complex, with just stunning work by the rhythm section. So Cheevers left in 1968, and that's when Gary Moore joined the band. And as I mentioned, in 1968, they released two singles, New Faces, Old Places, and the second one was called, oh, I don't have it on here. So I can't tell you what the second single was. But by late 1968, Lynott was pushed out of the band, and they became a power trio. And Phil Lynott went on to his own band called Blue Orphanage, and I don't know if there's any recordings of them. The second Thin Lizzy album pays tribute to that band, using the name Tales of the Blue Orphanage in the title. And oh, here it is. Skid Row recorded a second single called Saturday Morning Man. And interestingly enough, they ended up re-recording that for an unreleased third album, a full band version. But like I say, those first two singles are mostly acoustic. You can kind of tell it's Skid Row. They're available on a CD called Live and on Song. And it's really wonderful to hear them. And recently, some other early Skid Row with Phil Lynott demos apparently were discovered in 2006, and some of those are posted on YouTube. Well worth checking out. I'll put those in the link below. And so between 1969 and 1970, Skid Row played a lot of shows with big bands, most notably Fleetwood Mac, and Peter Green became a big fan of Gary Moore and brought the band to CBS Records. So in the UK, they came out on CBS. In America, they came out on Epic. And so they released a third single, Sandy's Gone, Part 1 and 2 in 1970, and it shows the full power trio. And so a great introduction to what was to come. And then in October of 1970, they released their first album, Skid. And it's really something to hear. It's pretty stripped down. There's not a lot of overdubs, possibly recorded live, but some great, amazing trio work. Like I say, the rhythm section of Noel Bridgman and Bruce Shields is as good as they get. and they kind of remind me of Taste in the sense that they've got a stunning lead vocalist guitar player, and then a rhythm section that can handle almost anything and have jazz elements. And so two great bands that came out of Ireland. Taste has more of a reputation, but everybody should know Skid Row as well. And then by 1971, they released the album 34 Hours, the one I mentioned earlier. Now, that was actually my introduction to the band, and they call it 34 Hours because apparently they recorded it in 34 hours. And when you hear it, it's pretty hard to believe. Um, there's a couple of little kind of acoustic ditties on there, but there's some just full on power trio hard rock on these records that has to be heard to be believed. Really oblique melodies. Noel Bridgman's vocals are killer, as are Gary Moore. So the two vocalists in the band, they're both have really interesting sound, and the vocal melodies that both of them created for all these songs are really interesting and bizarre, and kind of show the jazz influence. And then Gary Moore's guitar work, I think he was 17 by the time the Skid Row records came out. He's astonishing. Anybody that's ever heard him knows he's astonishing, but the fact that he was that astonishing at that young of age and does all the crazy guitar work on these first two Skid Row albums is really uh, unbelievable. And so then they released a fourth single, a version of Night of the Warm Witch, which is a different take and has some interesting overdubs, different than the 34 Hours album, and then a non-LP B-side called Mr. Deluxe, which of course is available as a bonus track these days. And oddly enough, I only found out that they toured the U.S. because there's a bootleg out there circulating of Skid Row from about 71 that purportedly has John Bonham of Led Zeppelin sitting in with them, but the sound quality is so bad, it's really hard to tell. But if you're a real diehard, search that out. And they toured the U.S. in 1970 and 71. In 1970, they toured with Canned Heat, and I'm sure the Canned Heat audience was probably their eyes glazed over when Skid Row had opened for Canned Heat. They're both blues based, but that's about it. And Skid Row's bizarre song structures and their frenetic music was probably lost on a Canned Heat audience. I don't know, but they actually recorded a third album. I didn't know that until about the last 20 years. It was recorded in 71, not long after 34 Hours, and it's a radical change in direction. Fortunately, it's been released now, and it's a lot more straightforward. And there's piano and like I say, a remake of a couple of their old tunes, and it's even got some ballads. There's one ballad that has harpsichord and cello. Um, but it finishes with a song called Silver Bird, and it's right up there with the greatest material Skid Row ever did. Of course, for my money, I would have rather had that third album be all crazy step forward for Skid Row, because it really captures all the weirdness of the first two Skid Row albums, and is one of the best things they've ever recorded. Incredible. I wish the whole album was like that, but I'll take the more subdued, more straightforward rock album of the third album because it's Skid Row. But it shows that they were progressing and moving in new directions pretty quickly. The fact that it was recorded that soon after 34 Hours is impressive. And I don't know if the band broke up and they didn't release the third album, or maybe the label turned down the third album. Seems more likely because they broke up, because it seems like the label would have really been behind that third album. And apparently, after that happened, Skid Row continued. And they brought in Paul Chapman, who later ended up in UFO, and Paul Chapman apparently re-recorded all those tracks for the Gary Moore parts. But as far as I know, that hasn't seen the light of day yet. I can't imagine what it would be like. But when Gary Moore left, he was actually replaced by Eric Bell, which surprises me because Eric Bell was in Thin Lizzy, and was in Thin Lizzy from what, 1970 to 1973. So interesting that Eric Bell would join the band at that point. As far as I know, there's no recordings of that. And then Brush Shields, the drummer of Skid Row, had a band called Brush right around that era. And once again, I don't know if there's any recordings of them out there, but a cool band. John Wilson from Taste on drums, on bass, Brush Shields on drums, and Adrian Fisher. Of course, Adrian Fisher ended up in Sparks. He was in the band Jet, and he also ended up in the final version of Boxer. Really cool guitar player and a trio, so I'm definitely down with that. And I'm not really going to get into all the bands after that, various versions, because there was a reunion of Skid Row in '73 with a new lineup, another Skid Row reunion in 1974 with a new lineup, 1975 a short reunion of the original band, and then of course Gary Moore ended up oddly enough. So you have Eric Bell from Thin Lizzy from '70 to '73 joining Skid Row briefly, but then you also have Gary Moore after leaving Skid Row joined Thin Lizzy. So there's a great window of wonderful Thin Lizzy material from '74. So Gary Moore was with them long enough to produce well over an album's worth of material, and it's too bad that the Gary Moore version in '74 of Thin Lizzy didn't actually release more material. I think he's on some of the singles, but and then of course Gary Moore would rejoin him in '78 for U.S. tour because Brian Robinson hurt himself, and then fully rejoined Thin Lizzy for the Black Rose album, which is pretty stunning. So all these interconnections, it's always fascinating to me and my bread and butter. But there you have it, Skid Row. Anybody that probably watches this channel already knows them full well, but I love that first album. That second album, they're a power trio like nothing I've ever heard. Like I say, the exotic arrangements, really oblique melodies, really stunning, unusual vocal parts you'd never hear anywhere else, and particularly on that 34 hours album. Gary Moore's guitar work is up there with anybody, and particularly in these long stretched out numbers that they do on those albums. He really shines, and there's a lot of overdubbing on there as well, so just stunning. So there you have it. A particularly fun episode for me to do because I love this band so much. I'm Brian Fox. Thanks for watching I Hate Rock Music.